My name is Connor Flanagan. I am the Director of Education here at the Southampton History Museum, and we're joined today by one of our trustees at the museum, Father Patrick. I've come to know Father Patrick over the last few years or so here at the museum, and honestly, probably one of the most knowledgeable people that I know as far as history goes, and a really nice guy. And basically, any time that I find out that he's giving a lecture with us, I'm like, oh, good. I don't have to worry. I know it'll be nice. So I'm gonna turn it over to you now, Father Patrick. I'll shut up. I'll let you go. And enjoy, everybody.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Connor. God bless you for that very flattering introduction. Hello, everyone. I think I can hear any of you. So this is, feel part of the pun coming from a priest. This is going to be an act of faith that you can continue to see me and hear me. So I know Connor's monitoring this for us, but we'll just make sure, and hopefully this will all go smoothly in the age of COVID and Zoom meetings. Obviously, I'm a little concerned about all this. What I'm going to do real quick, I'm going to share this screen if you'll be patient with me. And I imagine you all are going to see it because Connor and I looked at it to make sure it all looked wonderful. So there we go. I think everyone should be able to see this now. To make a long story short, as we begin to look at this topic of the retreat of death and the changing views of death and dying in 19th century America, by way of introduction, I have to just say a couple of words. In the worst days of the COVID shutdown, out on a park bench in front of my church, Tom Edmonds and I sat down and we were talking about things. And we were sort of philosophizing on this whole idea of whether or not, life would be different after COVID. How would we see ourselves? And how would we imagine society and the interactions we have after the event of COVID? And we're still in the midst of it for all intents and purposes. So one of the things that this drew from me in our conversation and led to this particular class is a sense that this was an epochal change that happened in the 19th century when we sort of saw a shift in how people looked at death and dying. And there's an element in this that I wanted to kind of draw out. And Tom said, sounds like a class, sounds like a lecture. And then lo, here we are today. So as we begin this, and I'm dreadfully sorry for the way of things that I can't hear you, because I would love for you to be able to respond to this. So forgive me if I just jump in now, and we'll save our questions obviously towards the end. One of the first things I wanted to first fault here. There we go, much better. One of the first things I wanted us to see are just a few images to contrast death and dying between the 19th and the 21st centuries, the way that people imagined it, what was normative, but also, I think more importantly, what was hoped for and expected, what was idealized. When we look at death of the 19th century, this left-hand image, which we're going to hear a lot about what they expected, is what we see here. Someone would have been home. Someone would have been surrounded by their loved ones. Someone would have, and the act of dying was something that much, if not all of the family would participate in. Yet likewise, we look forward, if we think about it today, in many instances, we die alone, or if not, we at least die in places where our lives are being supported artificially. And you can see there a very stark differentiation between those two. What causes death? How did we imagine death? On the left-hand side is obviously a very stylized image, but you see this thought of death as being an angel, something that gathered us up. Today, death looks like a virus. What we think about today in death can be something that is kind of almost unpersonal. It doesn't even look like it's alive, like a virus would be alive, but just something that looks almost like an abstract art. And then finally, how do we mourn? When you differentiate the idea that there's a whole set of death and mourning fashion and customs that were associated. And today, more times than not, as you see this gentleman on the left, no depreciation of him, but we'll tend to think about mourning as something that is handled inside of a sort of a day-to-day appearance. We don't have a ritual to it per se. We'll have a moment of sadness. We'll carry our burdens with us. But do we see ourselves engaged in a society of death? Not that long ago, people would put black wreaths on their doors, for instance. And it would be more than just wearing the black of mourning. it would be an indication that death had visited that house that day. Whereas now it's almost indistinguishable for many homes and communities. People don't engage and share in it in a community way like they did in the past. And I want to begin this examination by taking something that's on the very cusp of the 19th century, that as a death goes was an extremely seminal one for how we would look at the 19th century's views of death and dying. And that is the death of George Washington. This image is both poignant and should be only a little bit, if not a lot, cringy. Obviously, he's lying here in bed, just like we were told to expect. Martha at his head, his children about him, and yes, at his feet, his two slaves, his primary manservant and his wife's maid. They're there to adore him. They're loving him, all of them, including those whom he owned. And these are the popular perceptions that were extended. If you can see in this image, for the first time, America was struck by someone that the whole nation mourned. It was a national mourning. And this idea of him being somehow sacred and being lifted up by the angels into heaven with, the Virgin Mary in the left ear, sort of waving him on as he goes on his way. When I say the first time that America mourned, he was our nation's hero. He was our first president. We were so early on in our identity that this idea, December 14th, 1799, he died at home. Tragically, he was killed by his doctors. In an attempt to cure a fever, he was bled several times. Theoretically, from the quantity that the doctors carefully measured and recorded, he died from about 40% of his blood being let out intentionally. He was almost instantly interred, only 4 days later. Honestly, the reason why, there was no sense of embalming. In order to put someone into their coffin and to get them in the ground quickly, especially in Virginia, even in December, he was going to begin to get ripe. It was, by the way, if you ever visited Mount Vernon, the above image there on the left is his original tomb. And his new one was constructed much later, a little more grander, as you can see. He and Martha lie side by side, but he was only moved there in 1836, something that happened far later. But as I say, the first time America mourned, death came frequently and suddenly when the 19th century would come along. As I've already indicated, death could come being caused by the treatment from physicians. People were usually quickly interred, and ceremonies were only saved for the very great, sort of national pageantries. There would be a small, intimate sort of funeral that may go on in someone's home, and then they would be immediately carried out to the grave, and then everyone would carry on with their lives. If we look at 19th century death, there's a few characteristics I want you to see. Again, this is a classic picture, a little grainy here. But what I want you to sort of encompass in here is the fact that people, even late in the 19th century, as this image shows, would be shown in home. They'd be laid out in their home. The living room in a house was more often than not used as the death room. It was the place in which people would be put on display. They'd be buried out of there. Memorial services would only come later for sort of the common Joe. I want to say one thing as I breeze over very quickly about death being very frequent and easy and quick. In Cashiers, North Carolina, this is just an example and an image and what I wanted to say to you. If you go into the cemetery there, you see a line of tombstones. There's a father who lived a ripe old age into his 80s. And then there are 4 daughters, a wife, and a second wife, all buried in the same plot. The daughters and the wife all died in the course of 1 week. They died from measles. And it was enough to be able to not only wipe out the wife, but all the children as well. And then he remarried, and they were all buried together in a little row. And this sort of gives you an idea of the fact this is not unusual. This is not queer. People would have died very quickly in the course of the same amount of time, mostly from infectious diseases. So the possibility that somebody would live to a ripe old age was something that people necessarily just didn't count on. I want to give you an example from one person, fairly famous, had a bad time, but by no means unique. Salmon P. Chase. He was a member of the cabinet and would become a Supreme Court justice during the Lincoln administration. Rather ambitious fellow. By the way, just to look at that picture on the right, his face graces what is presently, at least, the largest individual piece or monetary amount of currency in American history. The $10,000 bill has Salmon P. Chase's on it, as I say, as a Secretary of the Treasury. Interesting fellow. That was only used, by the way, for bank transfers. It was never in general circulation, the $10,000 note. So if you ever have to answer this on Jeopardy, you owe me a piece of your winnings. But he had 3 wives. He had, first of all, Catherine, who he married in 1834. She died a year later in childbirth. By the way, he was away on a legal trip. You might think that that's the sort of thing he would carry in his heart for the rest of his life, and he did. He often wrote of his wife in sort of a romanticized, greatly, the affection he had. His older daughter would actually hide his diaries so as to seclude, to kind of hide the fact that he was very devoted to his first wife instead of for instance, her mother. But you can see here, he married Eliza in 1839. She died in 1844 of tuberculosis. And then almost hot on the heels, he marries Sarah, who marries in 1946. She herself dies in 1952. He, in essence, loses 3 wives in the course of under 20 years. He has his first daughter die before she's 4 years old. And as a total of 6 children, only 2 will survive their childhood. Keeping up with Salmon Chase, it shows us something else. Salmon Chase's daughter, Kate, did not even bother to come home from school when a younger sister died. She even writes home and says, essentially, I'm going to miss her. I love her so much, but I wish she hadn't died during finals week, is essentially what she said. This is not heartless. It's merely practical. I hate to say it, but in reality, people died, and they died a lot. In a family where you had 3 mothers go, and 4 of your 6 siblings, or I guess I would say 4 of your 5 siblings go, it was just something that you would think more about how to take up tomorrow, rather than necessarily worry about having someone passed. Now, let me talk a little bit about death rates. For most of human history, life expectancy was grievously short. When we go back to hunter-gatherers, for instance, and our ancient ancestors, we see the average life expectancy of 25 years. It's only till 1700 that we creep up to 37. By 1820, we had only gotten as high as 41. Early 20th century, you get to be 50 years old, and today, still today, it's 77 years old. And I'm going to make a point later on that if somebody dies at 77, you'll hear an exclamation, "So young." We're surprised by that. But 77 is our median age of the life expectancies today. Part of the reason that this life expectancy has increased, the mortality rate went down, was particularly first amongst children. Children were being treated more gently during the 19th century. We'll say more about that as we go along. But it's also because of the elimination of deaths from infectious diseases. We began to learn how infections came about. It was originally the most common cause of death. We also had improved nutrition and economic growth that sort of strengthened and bolstered people into better lifestyles. And we had better systems of sanitation, both in urban areas and rural areas and towns, for the delivery of clean water and the removal of waste, and also the teaching and receiving and learning of better personal health practices. I don't want us to get too cocky. This image on the right here is from 19th century New York City. Now, if you look at that, you're going to see a bunch of kids playing in the streets next to a dead horse. Before you start thinking how terrible that is, I want you to realize that little concrete thing that the kids are cooling their feet off in is an open sewer. That was the earliest sort of sewers that New York City had. So if you look at that, those children themselves are playing, their feet are dangling into fetid water that came out of people's homes and containing everything from feces to food waste. Not a pretty example, but it shows to us how far we've come. Just to be able to link it in, by the 1930s, mortality reduction was driven primarily by medicine. Vaccinations, antibiotics had come into place. And even then, we began to have greater and greater sort of expensive and intensive interventions that would help people to live longer. But that was only until pretty much into the middle part of the 20th century. We can't talk about it without turning to women. And one of the worst things that we can say about mortality is the death in childbirth. 3 to 4% of mothers died in childbirth. And it's important to say That's in each instance. So if a mother had multiple births, she ran a 3 to 4% chance of dying from childbirth. That's, by the way, if you were lucky enough to be having children at home, because of a lot of reasons having to do with exposure to other diseases, not knowing about communication of transmission of germs, et cetera. You had a higher chance, 8.5%, of dying if you were in one of the early hospitals. By the early 20th century, medicine regulations, better education had really reduced that. But one thing I want to stress to you is that 3 to 4% is when there was an average 7 live births per mother, as opposed to less than 2 today. So a woman planning to have children had a much, much higher rate or possibility of dying than we could ever possibly imagine today. So one of the things that really came into play was the mixed blessings of childbirth and the fact that you were playing with your life like Russian roulette. Another huge factor in the increase in death rate in the 19th century that sort of impacted people's perception is urbanization. Even towns were a huge factor in this, and it created both a higher chance for people to die by exposure with other human beings inside of cities, but also it created two classes of society. The urban diseased resistant people were folks that had been exposed to common diseases during their childhood and had built up immunities. On the other hand, people that lived in rural communities could be largely isolated from diseases and would find themselves being more disease vulnerable. This would really play themselves out during the Civil War. The rural South, far more detached and isolated, was much less resistant to diseases and death from epidemics and pandemics, would prove far greater amongst the Confederate soldiers than amongst the Union soldiers. This brings us up to a topic that I think is the turning point really for us in a discussion about death in the 19th century war, its perceptions of death and dying. The Civil War in the 19th century is that turning point. Nothing like it had ever come along up to this point. The scope of death really should stagger us today, though the numbers seem somewhat small from our perceptions. But what I want us to kind of look at is to see how much this moment, sort of really a 4-year span of time, helped to define and redefine people's perception of death and dying. One of the first things I want to say is, once again, like we said with George Washington, infections were the greatest cause of death. I said already, twice as many soldiers would die from infection from battle wounds than from the actual trauma of the wound. Put it this way, this is an interesting little tidbit for those of us that are from the South. We can get all proud on this. The infections were worse for Northern than for Southern soldiers because the North used reusable lint and linen dressings to work with the wounds, to clean up things and to bind them. Whereas in the South, they had a plethora of cotton available. And the beauty of cotton was it was not reused. So if someone would stuff a wound with cotton, when it was done, they would simply throw it away. And that would keep it from being transmitted, because they might, in a basin or in a tub, wash the linen bandage only to have it convey gas gangrene, the germs and the viruses, over to the new person. So literally gangrene might move from a severely wounded person to a relatively minor wounded person. And the sort of toxemia and things that can occur from that are really staggering. Again, they just didn't know. They didn't know how this was transmitted. So if they cleaned it, they figured it was clean. They could use it the next time. It was only by a lucky happenstance that the South had raw cotton to be able to use, whereas the North, being more industrialized, had more, though they reused it for economy purposes, linen bandages, woven bandages. Now, I use a larger number here because this is a more recent scholarship. Usually about 610,000 to 750,000 deaths of soldiers. 2/3 of those were caused either by uncontrollable infection or diseases. So if you imagine 750,000, 500,000 of those deaths from the Civil War of the soldiers were caused either by infections or by the passing of diseases inside of camps. People that had never been wounded in their lives were dying from epidemics just by being in camp with other soldiers. And it's important to be able to state that infectious diseases and epidemics got to be such an issue that they would cause delays in battles. So many of the soldiers were not able to take the field that they found themselves actually having to call off a battle or to move away from things. And this would prolong the fighting by some scholarly estimations as much as 2 years, just because things were dragged out because the armies couldn't take the field to face each other. Now, there's a few things to be able to say about that number. 750,000 of the population of 1860s translated to 2020 would be about 7.5 million deaths as a percentage of population today. That's a staggering number when we stop to think about it. At worst times, we heard people saying there would be 2 million deaths from coronavirus. God forbid we see those numbers in America. But this is 7.5 million deaths happening in a 4-year period directly related to soldiers from dying from one reason or another. 750,000. And it's important to say that before the Civil War, the government had no mechanism for identifying the dead. Dog tags, things like that. If you fell in the field, they would have to search your body for anything that might identify you. And God forbid you were hit by a cannonball or an explosion, they wouldn't know how many people were involved there. They had no mechanism to inform the families. How did somebody know someone died? Almost exclusively, it came from a comrade who would write a letter home. There was no mechanism for burying the dead. This is an amazing reality for me. The people just fell where they lay. And because of the nature of the battlefield at the time, people would move from place to place to place. There was no ambulance corps to be able to bring the dead back to the army hospitals. For that matter, there was no army hospitals. There were no aid agencies for the wounded or for the families at home. And there was no provision financial support for the widows and the orphans. This is a war that brought people to the place that it was catastrophic. For all of the magnitude of death, it deeply affected people, more deeply than we can imagine today, because it really struck them heavily. There were no national cemeteries, no memorial days, expressions of ways to be able to do this. It's only after the Civil War that people began to collect in a unified place the people that died in war, for instance, or for that matter, to create a day to remember them. These things didn't exist. By the way, just to be able to clarify, you may know this building here. That is the original Custis Lee House, which is actually now the main house that's attached to Arlington National Cemetery, right across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. The land that the Arlington National Cemetery was built on was Robert E. Lee's plantation. And his home used to overlook from a high site. If you've ever seen it, you'll recognize the building. It looks down over the Potomac and actually has a bird's eye view, if you will, of our nation's capital. One of the first grounds to be dedicated after Arlington is the Gettysburg Cemetery. And this is where we begin to see an interesting sea change in the understanding of what war was about. A lot of the people that went into war went in for a cause. Many times prior to the Civil War, people were pressed into service. If you needed to have a military, they were either professional class soldiers that could do no better, or they would be drafts. You would essentially, especially in Britain, for instance, they'd go along the wharf side, and there were press gangs that had the ability to just simply grab somebody out of the bar and take them back to the ship, and they were now enlisted in the Royal Navy, for instance. But in America, people in this war particularly were being brought in because they were brought to believe that they were risking their lives and engaging in a great battle with the intent of doing something important. This image on the left is a rather hastily taken image, because at the Gettysburg Battlefield is, of course, the very famous Gettysburg Address from Abraham Lincoln. That address was originally only about 2 minutes long. The person who spoke before him was over an hour. So the photographer wasn't really ready. He was already, as you can see in this picture, he's in the very center. He's moving towards, from your perspective, moving towards the left with his, stovepipe hat on. He had completed his address and was taking his seat again when the photographer quickly snapped this shot off, because they figured they had time to move around and get a better angle. But he says very important words here that speak to not only this idea of a memorial cemetery, the idea of the battle, but the way people saw death. Briefly, just to quote from it, "We come here to dedicate a portion of it, this battlefield, as a final resting place for those who died here, the brave men living and dead who struggled here, have hallowed it far above our poor powers to add or detract. And this is an interesting thing. What he's saying here is that now all of a sudden, this isn't just a place to put people to die. This has a special meaning because it reflects upon how we feel about what we're doing in this war, about what their deaths meant, and it's supposed to ennoble and inspire us. We see here, from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to the cause for which they here gave that last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. This is finding in itself a new reason to look at not just death in general, but a collective unified death. That the death of our soldiers is something that is supposed to inspire and make greater meaning of the purpose for which we fight. Now I'm sort of shifting here about what happened afterwards. 3 years after the Civil War, on May 5th, 1868, the head of what was sort of essentially the Union veterans, the Grand Army of the Republic, established a thing called Decoration Day. It was a time to decorate the graves with flowers and other things. This political cartoon on the left is making fun of President Ulysses S. Grant, that you can see there, essentially using his war past and this aggrandizement from the perspective of the cartoonist as a way of saying, that he was somehow the chief mourner of a people and therefore using it for political gain. It's important to note that in the years after the Civil War, $75 million of public funds were spent for memorials and monuments and cemeteries. The people who died in the Civil War often lay where they were. Later, they would finally begin to bury them. And when they did, there would be these mass graves. They later came back and deinterred the bodies and would put them in orderly fashion. If you've seen in gardens of stone, as it's called, rows and rows and symmetry, sometimes quite beautiful for the eye, but very poignant in its meaning as you see rows and rows and going off to the horizon, these graves. But it's also important to note, for an idea of understanding perceptions north and south, no money was provided for Southern graves and Southern memorials. It was strictly for Union soldiers. And as a result, there was an important, I think, a poignant reimagining in the South. I'd like to be able to just kind of touch on this very briefly, but I think talking with Connor, there's a real chance of a really good later class on looking at the question of Southern monuments and lost cause and the idea of racism inside monument displays. What I'm speaking of right here is the very earliest monuments, not the ones that came in the 1920s and later. A lot of these were reactions across the South to the slight that was made to the Southern dead, the fact that there was no provision for monuments and for cemeteries for the Southern dead. The first thing we see in the immediate years following this is decoration days in the South. These were, very widespread. They were very important. People would come out and do a lot of things in order to do that. And there was a beginning of an early organization called the Ladies Memorial Association. This is a group, not the UDC, that starts in 1890s. This was an organization whose sole goal was to take care of the dead of the South that were scattered and lost inside various places and sites, and to reinter them in better places. Large number of donations were done. It's entirely privately raised to recover, reinter, and put in new ceremonies and to build memorials. This memorial here is an example of that early Confederate memorialism. This is from the state capitol in Alabama. And this one was erected by the Ladies Memorial Society in the years immediately after the Civil War. And in this, you see now is an interesting political angle. If we have inside the Gettysburg Address this idea of the immortalization of the high cause of union and freedom, on the other side, you begin to see an expression of, especially if you see yourself in Reconstruction, see yourself as an occupied nation, still see yourself as being slighted by the federal government and not being memorialized. You begin to see now an expression of memorialism and aggrandizing of the dead that says they fought in vain, but we will not forget them. And we begin to honor them. And you start seeing in death, coming in this latter stages, even more so, like we saw in George Washington, a reimagining of individual death, as especially in war, as something that was noble and aggrandizing and inspiring. I think the apotheosis of this sentiment on both sides, North and South, can be found inside things like the Vietnam War Memorial. If you look at a lot of the war memorials, they're very generalistic. This is one that specifically remembers every single person by name. The memorial itself is almost individual in its origin. What did they expect a good death to look like? Like we've already seen, it was part of life. It happened in your home. You had your family around you. You would always be able to say, I'm ready to go. No one died by surprise. If you were dying of an illness or an infection, you had time to know you were in probably death's door, and you could gather the family around. You would be able to express yourself. You would somehow make your peace with everyone. You'd have a chance to make your peace with God. And it was very important to have those last words and to have that last scene, something that the family shared in. However, when it came to the Civil War, this was something that was lost. Many of the guys would write their goodbyes to their families and have them on their person so that someone would hopefully mail them for them. Parents were only most often written by their comrades. Occasionally they were written by people in the government, more times than not, maybe by the commanding general or officer over them. But although Lincoln himself did do that on occasion, and some of those are quite poignant, families would often leave home to travel to try to find their loved ones. They would be looking both for deathbed scenes to be related to them, but they would also want to find their graves to take them home. Unfortunately, they didn't really actually get a chance to find them in most cases. Many times they were disappointed in being able to find their beloved's grave, even if it was marked. Mourning became very stylized as a result. There's almost a whole culture of death. On the left, you can see obviously the mourning dress in black. Very common, as you can imagine, when that large percentage of people passed away. On the right is a particularly spooky kind of a creepy, actually, sort of a memento. It's a mourning brooch, and that sort of interesting weave design is taken from the hair, locks of hair of the beloved. That was thankfully as far as most of the grisly sort of relics that people would wear. It was mostly hair. But if you get a chance to Google them, I think you'd be surprised to see the extent to which hair weaving and hair art, some of them were huge. There was, things you would frame and put on your wall that was made up of the hair of the departed for a family. Perhaps the most symbolic and profound of these, and there's a wonderful book written on, I'm going to mention at the end of our talk, is when Lincoln died. His assassination became very symbolic, and he ended up becoming almost an embodiment of the cause and of liberty and all the things that he spoke of in the Gettysburg Address. It happened on Good Friday, the day that Jesus died inside the Christian calendar. That's enough, but it also died at the moment of victory. He really became to stand as a symbol of our dead, was the way it was articulated. Unlike the situation we had with George Washington, who was buried in his home with nobody ever being able to sort of have a focal point. They referred to it as the invisible corpse. In this case, Lincoln went on parade. He had a national tour. He went through almost all of the North. There's a wonderful image of Teddy Roosevelt as a boy looking out of his window in his Fifth Avenue house of his family, with Lincoln's cortege rolling by in New York. There was literally a dearth of black crepe in the North. Nobody could get black material to hang from the streets to be able to wear and things of that sort. He was obviously lionized. One day, if I ever do a talk on Abraham Lincoln for the History Museum, I will bring up largely my belief that he would probably not nearly have been loved as he is had he survived through his second term. For many, many reasons, but dying as he did, anything that people didn't like about him was washed away. And it's interesting to note that so popular was his body and his embodiment that there was actually an attempt to steal his body from Springfield, to hold it for ransom. And it's an interesting little fact. If you ever go there, what used to be a crypt, not unlike you saw out inside, a little tomb box inside of George Washington's tomb, Lincoln was actually had his tomb, and they poured concrete in it, sealed him and his children, so that they could never get to his body again. Lincoln, the mourning of Lincoln, literally made him a money-making venture for the nefarious. Now, part of this has to be understood in the overall sense of a rising philosophy of life that we find inside the 19th century, a thing called sentimentalism. Now, if I say, oh, that's very sentimental, what does that mean to us? It has a lot of connotations of Christmas cards and, keeping heirlooms and keepsakes from our children, and, putting away baby clothes and things like that. But sentimentalism is something that actually began to emerge in the latter part of the 18th century in Europe. It's a moral philosophy found on the belief that individuals are able to form relationships and communities because they, by effort of their imagination, their ability to sit there and think about it and to have feelings that are evoked, become to understand each other's feelings. Emotionalism really is the heart of everything that we would think of in terms of 19th century religion. Methodism is considered to be an emotional religion. In Christianity, there were the frozen chosen of my tradition, the Episcopalians, but there were other groups that if you didn't have an ecstatic experience of your religious life, it wasn't authentic. Patriotism was caught up in sentimentality as we begin to see more and more patriotic art and images to try to capture our attention. And it almost becomes the seminal characteristic and gift to the nation of the 19th century. On the right-hand side, this famous image that we have of Florence Joyce, I believe, was the photographer of the pea picker's wife from the Great Depression, is a landmark example of the ability for us to try and evoke a reaction by playing on our emotions so that we empathize with someone and we begin to change our thoughts and ideas based upon what we feel. And this is what we begin to see inside here, this notion that we feel something, and the emotions of this is what changes our minds. American authors of both sexes, male and female, this wasn't exclusively like a gal thing, really began to do this. They began to cultivate readers' sympathies with others in order to promote either self-improvement, to make yourselves better, to motivate actions to relief of suffering, to reinforce social unity, and to build a national identity. We played on our emotions to make ourselves want to be something else. And, it's entwined with domesticity, this whole idea of the family, but it also played into imperialism. This idea that we could want to manifest destiny. All of these things were played into this notion of sentimentalism. In public and private rituals, the idea of a Memorial Day is something that really shows to people the idea that we keep alive those sacrifices long after the names of the dead have been forgotten. And it becomes the dominant ideology for America in the 19th century. Sentimental writings and practices would be used for politics, for reform and to be able to look at repression differently. And they played a major role in what we would think of as bourgeois consciousness. It's a word that gets kind of a negative sentimentality. But the idea for us that what we think of is that even though we may not have been engaged in the suffering of others, we can be moved to care about them and do something about it. And if we think that this doesn't really play itself out in a major way, I want to bring you to this lady here, Harriet Beecher Stowe. You've got to know that name. In my historizing and my talks on the Civil War, I really say that she's the person that made the United States Civil War happen. And I'm not alone in thinking that. She was inspired to bring death into this play again by the idea of her own child dying. She had a beloved child who died of disease, an infection. And she also began to empathize with that pain with an earlier experience she had seen of a slave mother being separated from her child, the weeping that this mother had. And so in an attempt, what she did was, again, to try and find meaning in the death of her child, she came to this idea that what she wanted to do was to write this book. More than any factor, in my opinion, this novel changed how the North felt about slavery. And famously, one of my favorite quotes of Abraham Lincoln and Harriet Beecher Stowe is that when he met her during the Civil War, he was quoted as saying, "I finally get to meet the little lady who started this great war." What she did was she made the North care about Southern slaves. In the book, it was translated into all the major languages. It was a bestseller in the United States that was only second best to the Bible in terms of the number of people that would buy and read it. It proved that emotions and desires were played out as a leading role in the anatomy of morality. People were brought to want to feel something, and that emotions were the primary source of moral knowledge. How do you know what you think is right and wrong? It's because you've come to feel about it in a way that's very different. I can't go into any conversation about 19th century death without saying something very, very brief about post-mortem photography. It is a weird, interesting hobby amongst people. People get very excited about this. It is fundamentally creepy as heck. It did give in its time people an opportunity to remember and to have images of past relatives. The photographers of the day sold this stuff like it was a major product of theirs. They really wanted people to get excited about it. I will warn you that many of the ones you'll find on the internet and in antique shops, even if they're originals, are hoaxes or they're mislabeled. The reality was you had to stay, you see this, the alive boy on the left is blurry because, God help him, he moved when the photograph was being taken. But you can see crystal clear the young child in the coffin. So often you'll hear people say, oh, they got a little bracket behind their heads to hold them up. That's because they're dead. That bracket was a common invention used by photographers to make you hold your head still when you were alive. So the vast majority of them that people will say is a post-mortem photography is just because someone just shut their eyes because they blinked and they were told to stay still, and they thought, I'm not gonna leave my eyes open because I'm gonna blink and I'm gonna ruin the picture. Did I mention, by the way, it's really creepy? It is, but no more creepy than our fascination with them. The fact that people would take photographs of their deceased, we can't get enough of them. It really is a big deal in sort of antique collections. Now, what happened? What happened from this rising sense of sentimentalism is in the latter part of the 19th century, after the Civil War, we begin to see a rise in what's called objectivity and skepticism, what we're going to start referring to as modernity. Idealism and sentimentality were slow casualties of the Civil War and Reconstruction. America, after looking back on that suffering and the relative impotence of the cause to be able to keep together or to achieve what it sought to do, brought people more and more into a different place. For many Americans, especially the ones that served in the war, everything after that seemed banal. Many of the people, the reunions that you see from both North and South of the soldiers, is because they were trying to recapture the most important and impressive part of their lives. And life afterwards just didn't seem to have the importance that it had. And they had a lot of survivor's guilt and a sense that, have I lived up to the potential of the sacrifice and the work we did then? We tend to see morality being more and more based upon economic and scientific evaluations. People become increasingly sort of subjective, subjective instead of objective. And so as a result, we begin to see decreases in patriotism and religious fervor, as well as social optimism. Folks just didn't think the world was actually going to get any better because we tried so hard to make it better then, and it just didn't seem to be getting any better now. The human beings to be able to create and improve and reshape their environment was somehow thought that we could use experimentation and science and technology. We were looking at everything anew again. We were re-examining every aspect of existence. And we looked at things and said that some of this might just be holding us back. And we were placing it in new ways and new ideas of being able to reach the same ends we had initially. And there were a lot of diverse thinkers, but I think the fathers of this especially are Charles Darwin and Friedrich Nietzsche. If you ever want to really get bored and go to sleep, get me to talk about how Nietzsche and Darwin were essentially the philosophers, to us in Marx, I would bring those in too, but they are really children of Darwin that brought up what we think of as 20th century's primary political philosophies, communism and fascism. But that's a story for another time. So we can also just peek into our own age and see just a little bit about postmodernism. If what we saw before was this increasing sense of skepticism, postmodernism tries to outdo modernism's skepticism. It's an attitude that looks at irony now and rejection towards what was described as grand narratives. After we lived past fascism, after we lived past communism, that utilized modernity's ideas into making political and social and terrible wars ideas, postmodernism sort of says we can't buy into that. And ideologies that are associated, we just don't do that anymore. Often criticize rationality. The idea of focusing on ideologies and the idea of maintaining political and economic power is a trademark of our modern postmodernism. We begin to be suspicious of the rich. We begin to be suspicious of the powerful. I think when we look at some of the recent elections, one of the questions we could raise is the glory of the neophyte. Someone that's not like the old guard, and we don't like the career politicians and career leaders of various types. So what of death now? Kind of coming to our conclusion here, one of the things I want to say is we feel, notice the quotations here, safer. If we were having this talk a year ago, I wouldn't put the quotations on there, would I? We feel safer. When we look at causes of death, these are in order, by the way: heart disease, cancer, unintentional injuries, respiratory disease, strokes, Alzheimer's, diabetes. Disease is all the way down at the bottom. What is this? That's like number 8 on our list. All of a sudden, our perceptions of that is very much different. We're very much caught on the idea that disease has reared its head again. And if you look at this, heart disease, how much of our lives are tied in with watching what we eat, exercising more, taking away carcinogens, things of that sort, so that we can control heart disease, cancer. But then you have a novel virus that comes along. And all of a sudden we begin to question whether we really are safer. And in a way, we're very angry. We begin to hurl accusations and things of that sort, because part of what's happening to us is that we no longer feel as safe as we did a year ago. Mourning. This picture is kind of creepy, kind of weird, kind of see it coming in your own neighborhood soon. This is a death pod. And if you read it from left to right, this is essentially, you put grandmom in the pod, the nice white one that's sitting there, and it grows a tree. And grandmom slowly ceases to exist because she's taken up into the tree. This is a hot new product. Spreading ashes away from cemeteries, no longer having places with monuments and markers and things of that sort, are kind of going away. Sentimentalism still exists, but it doesn't really reside inside our social areas, though we can still be appealed to. We are not purely cured of sentimentalism. We kind of want to go back to nature. Part of the reason that we like having the idea of cremation is that you don't take up square footage. And also you can go back into things, and this body pod is a really great idea because people love the idea that, you're gone and you're a tree and that's it. Then we got a forest instead of a cemetery. And we also tend to evaluate things largely today more and more by economics. Much of our morality is predicated on one of the last remaining objective fields we have. Do the dollars add up? And this is one of the things that we find ourselves more and more placing an emphasis on whether death is worth it or not. Is it too costly? Becomes the question. Coronavirus. As of my last Google it this morning, our deaths in the US were at 234,000 people dying. Now, I don't mean to minimize those deaths. What I want you to do is I want you to imagine a contrast of perception. It's really cut us deeply, 234,000 people so far. In the Civil War, we already talked about 750,000, equivalent to a much higher population, 2.4% of our total population, or 7.5 million people today. If we put Justin down a certain demographic, Southern men between the ages of 20 and 24, it accounts in 1860 alone, 22.6% of Southern men. I don't think that's right. I think it's actually the entire Civil War, but still imagine that, approaching a quarter of all Southern men. Now, I don't want to minimize our deaths today, but when we contrast the 19th and 21st centuries, one of the things I think we have to do in our conversation and thinking is a little bit of perspective. Not to say, "How come on, guys, it's not that big a deal," but for us to kind of appreciate what our ancestors went through in the 19th century, but also to ask ourselves, how did they react to it? And how do we react to it? What does this teach us about our perceptions of our own mortality and what death means to us today as we look at, and by the way, look at that down there. One of the things I want you to recognize in that picture is not just that you got a team of people, and God bless it, this is a coronavirus patient, but amongst those, what, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people, how many of those folks are largely goosed up like that, covered up in things to protect themselves? One of the things I want us to imagine is with death, we don't see it no more. It's no longer in our lives, but we also expect to live into our 80s or later. Medicine largely perceives death as a defeat and work very hard to be able to put it off. Much of the treatments today are done, and even over treatments today can be done in order to try and forestall death, to live, to make it happen somehow. Medicine has for us become more trustworthy. There tends to be an over-treatment, but also erroneous treatment. I forget the exact statistics. My brother was spewing them at me this last week, but the likelihood of one going into death is on a yearly basis in 100,000, if not more. We tend to look now at euthanasia and perceptions of a good death. We no longer want to be there with, we want to die on our own terms. And by that, we mean no suffering, no unnecessary economic costs. And quite frankly, euthanasia has just been made legal in Holland for children. True story. Minors. We also seek to protect ourselves from death at almost every cost. We have a decreased sense of death as being something that is a cause or a duty. And so as we kind of come to our close here, one of the things I want to just point out is that we expect to live and are greatly challenged by death and dying. If we die, by the way, and we will, we often find to seek blame and mitigation. Very, very few people, except for the very elderly, go to death at peace with it. We tend to flee from the company of death. And those who do not are perceived as being morbid. If I did this talk, and I saw Georgette Chapek, she's a member of my church, she hates this, on our one of our attendees. I did a thing on a book called The Tour of Bones for Lent one year, and it was a mixed bag of tricks. Some people just didn't want to ever see that thing again. In closing, I just want to mention a few books that I think are worthy of your time. First of all, Sacred Remains, America's Attitude Towards Death from 1799 to 1883 by Gary Lederman. If you're looking for visual images, and I think some quite beautiful, Misere, The Visual Representations of Misery in the 19th Century by Thomas Hudson. Likewise, around the Civil War, I would bring out The Republic of Suffering, Death and the American Civil War by Drew Gilpin Faust. And I think an incredibly interesting book. Yes, I'm a Lincoln scholar, but Martha Hood's book on Mourning Lincoln is a tour de force and exhaustive. The Culture and Art of Death in the 19th Century America by Tula Lightfoot, and The Representations of Death in 19th Century U.S. Writings and Culture, an edited collection of scholarly papers by Lucy Frank. And if you just don't want to pick up a book, I would recommend to you two films. One, for further viewing, Death in the Civil War. It was an American Experience episode, How the Unthinkable Became Unforgettable in the American Civil War. It was an American Experience episode. And sort of a modern look at death would be Being Mortal, a Frontline episode. Again, these are all available on PBS video as well as probably online. Re-examining death and dying from a surgeon, from a sort of medical perspective, and trying to say, don't think of it as being a failure of medicine, but just part of living. It's, for me, is interesting because it talks about where we may be going one day. It's all pre-corona, though. I think everything's back into the air while we still experience that. So that, my friends, is what Uncle Pat has brought you today. And I've gone over my time. God bless us. I'm sorry. Connor, are you there, my friend? Ruh-roh. Yes, I would definitely say, I'm looking here from pardon me, I'm going to say, I assume it's Pi, please forgive me. Is it saying hair, jewelry, and post-mortem photography as creepy, reflecting a 21st century sensibility? Oh, you bet. I would actually say it's more creepy that we're so fascinated by it. Because I think in the 19th century, it was sentimentality. It was the ability to hold on to something that belonged to people, and sort of excited and inspired people. And people wanted any thread to hold on to someone. With death being often so frequent, a beloved would be something that you would lose. And in an age before widespread photography, having something tangible to hold on to is extremely important. That's absolutely true. A memento mori, very good. Yes, it is really that. It's an ability to have that. I'm going to try and text Connor and see if he can turn on the question and answer session. So bear with me. Whoops. There he is. Hello, Connor. You came on just in time. Perfect timing.
Okay.
So I answered one question from a panelist that put it in on the Q&A or on the chat thing. So I'll let you take over. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Yeah, sorry about that, everybody. The Internet Museum died. I was very nervous that the whole thing died, but thankfully you were able to finish the talk, and I only just missed the last few minutes. Let's see. I did have a question that came in via text message from my boss, Tom Edmonds, who said, hopefully this isn't the similar question, but he asked, why do you think the high count of the world's COVID death seems to be somewhat ignored today?
So you say that again, seems somewhat more what?
The high COVID death around the world is somewhat ignored today. Why is that?
I think it's interesting because my perception of things, and this is as a social observer, is I like to look at this and think to myself, in no small fashion, we prize individuals, I think, more so. I heard it once said that if God forbid, a child falls down a well in Texas, I'm showing my age, but there was an instance in which the whole nation was wrapped by that experience of a little girl in a well. And we see things like this. Large numbers tend to lose value for us. If we stop to think imagine, for instance, 6 million, God forbid to say this, but 6 million Jews dying in the Holocaust is almost an abstraction. But when you have someone like Elie Wiesel who writes about his own individual experiences and you see that individual moment, then it becomes something poignant. Of course, he won a Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize, quite deservedly, for his ability to translate something abstract. To say slaves in the South, even in the time of the Civil War, Harriet Beecher Stowe changed. I mean, you had people like William Lloyd Garrison and others that wrote ad nauseum letters and tried to everything from inciting people to simply informing people to invoke their emotions, to get them involved, to make the North give a hoot. I like to tell people that William Lloyd Garrison was almost lynched for his anti-slaving perspective in Boston. Northern people were going to put him in a box. And what changed people's hearts was Harriet Beecher Stowe, because she made the story personal. And it came down to an individual person. I think still today, when we hear the numbers, it scares us. And that's an important thing. I think part of what, if you go like, on most of the cable news channels, at least for a long time there, it was like a ticker tape. They would show you the numbers clicking up. And it invoked us into fear, and it also invoked us to watching them. But what's important about that is that I think that all that becomes an abstraction. It's when it hits close to you. One of the most poignant things I had was people began asking, did you know someone who, when it happened to me, when someone I knew passed, a priest in New Orleans, for instance, that was really engaging to me. When I knew someone like Marty Gilmartin and Pam Gilmartin here in the city, in our village, who got it, it was like, that's a parishioner of mine. I know that person. I've been in their home. And suddenly it shook me to my core. So I think it's interesting. I think that we get more attached. And again, I think that's the remnants of and by the way, we're not over sentimentalism, but I think that sounds over sentimentalism a word. We're not done with sentimentalism because I think we're still caught in that.
Yeah, I was taking some notes as you were talking about stuff, and specifically when you were talking about modernism and postmodernism and stuff, and thinking about today and how we react to death and all that stuff. I was sort of thinking that it to me at least, it feels that a lot of people today are somewhat caught up in ideas of narcissism slightly and solipsism, thinking that the world is just you and everyone else is around you. And I get caught up in thinking those ways in certain things, and people, because it's always like, oh, why did this happen to me? And so, like you were saying, these big abstract numbers, it's hard to quantify.
I agree.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny, and this is, I'm going to cover up my collar here so you don't think it's the priest talking. It's trying to be the historian talking, is that there is a shift toward, and I kind of talked about when I was talking about the Vietnam War Memorial. It comes in the 1950s, because if you look at other war memorials, there'd be representative individuals, probably even an obelisk, or it would be something like Liberty or something like that, Lion, something like that. One of the earliest individualized memorials becomes, if you've been to Washington, for instance, is the Korean War Memorial. There are people, ordinary foot soldiers, not General so-and-so with a sword in his hand and a horsey. And when you go to the Vietnam War Memorial, it's every single person. And that to me is kind of an interesting reality, is that we begin to see, because, you know, when you spoke of the Civil War, for an individual, it might be their person, but for a nation, we had the generals, we had the leaders, we had the president, especially Lincoln, God bless him, dying right on the heels of Appomattox. Interesting little side story just for fun. I hope this will be amusing for your time. He was supposed to be joined in the box at Ford's Theater by Ulysses S. Grant and his wife. And if anyone's had any classes with me about Lincoln, you know, I don't have a very fond feeling about Mary Todd Lincoln. Literally, Grant's wife said, I am not sitting in that box with that woman. And so he begged off and went somewhere else. Otherwise, it's possible that Booth may have had some damage to him, because Major Rathbone, who was in the box, was severely wounded by the Bowie knife that he wielded. So originally, Booth thought he was going to get 2 for 1. He was going to bag Lincoln and Grant.
Interesting.
That's what I live for. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. We have some other questions that came in, I think, from Georgette Chappick. Thank you. This was interesting. Turning grandma into a light fixture is creepy. Yeah.
I agree.
And
I don't.
Somebody else. They're just saying a wonderful presentation. So no other questions on that front.
Okay. I kept you guys late.
Yeah.
Thank you for your patience, you 11 who stuck it out. Truly.
Wait, I think we might actually have one more question.
Okay.
I'm learning how this works on my phone now versus the computer. And so, yeah, the last question before we go is, we have someone asking, do you think death today is sanitized?
Absolutely. Sanitized and made more powerful as a result. I think if we look, it used to be that people died in your home. Children would be present when their parent died. More times than not, and by the way, death is never clean. I will leave that to your imagination. But, you know, deathing is, you know, in the movie, somebody just kind of, the head goes to one side and that's it. It can be messy, and it can also be terrible. One of the first things that happen in hospice care today is that people are made comfortable, which in a lot of ways indicates that they're doped to the gills. We don't hear people suffering. And I don't know if that means that people aren't suffering. That's an interesting question. We made them more comfortable. We've just made them more placid. A friend of mine who's a physician once told me that painkillers don't take away the pain, they just make you don't care so much about it. But in that sense, also, our lack of attachment to death has made it seem more powerful than it really is. I don't make light of it when I say we are all going to die. Bugs Bunny famously said, "You can't take life too seriously. No one's getting out of it alive." And that's kind of a laugh, but it really is. And in many ways, I think some of our modern reactions, and this is me kind of, I won't say I'm politicking, but it's my perspective on COVID-19. I think it's important for us to put on masks. I think it's important for us to wash our hands, to follow all the regimens we need to do. I'm very worried about us retreating from life. This was named the retreat of death. One of the things that I'm more afraid of is our retreating from death and retreating from life in the process. I mentioned very briefly that we've done a lot to ensure that we're safe at all costs. Some people have, and we really, really have. And the hardest thing for me is, if this is a long-term experience, how will it change us if we find ourselves deciding that what's important to do is to say, under no circumstances am I willing to risk my life? Because for us, death becomes the worst thing that can happen to us. Now, part of that is because we had a far more faithful age. Everyone expected that death was going to be just a momentary goodbye, and we'd be reunited in heaven with our beloveds, and we pick up from there. Quite frankly, in the case of African-American slaves, for instance, death might just be a welcome respite. You might find yourself saying, I get to go to glory. If you were very, very poor and not even of color and enslaved, you might actually find death as being important. One of the reasons that the Catholic Church and many other parts of the church preach that suicide is a mortal sin is because many people throughout Christian history have thought, well, heck, let's just go ahead and hasten this process and I get to go to a better place. Yeah, I think death has become something that we're actually terrified of now. And it becomes something that, there's so many thoughts and inventions about how we can prolong life. One of the things I hear people say, it was a cover of National Geographic. And today, a child being born should expect, we believe, that it will see past 100 as an ordinary thing. I said 80s, we expect to live in our 80s. Our children should expect to live into their hundreds. Normatively. What does that mean? Economically, I don't care. What it means emotionally for us is what does a child, what does a youth, what does an accident mean to us then? And I think in part, if we talk about tort reform and talk about lawyers for a second, got to bring them into the game. We talked about doctors. I think that in some ways, our sense of lawsuits is born from a sense that any death, even an accidental one, is a blaming thing, that we find something that we want to come after and say that should not have happened.
Yeah, this is definitely a lot. I would say probably a lot more to think about after this lecture than maybe some of our normal ones. But it's good. It's good. I want to thank you again, Father Patrick, for doing this. I want to thank everybody for sticking around for the few extra minutes that we had here, and apologies for any technical issues that may have come up. But thank you, everybody, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their day.
Thank you all so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.